Kia ora, Mike. It is fantastic to have you back following your recent trip over to Montreux in Europe at the WBCSD 2023 Liaison Delegate Meeting. As you noted in your video update when you were still on the ground, it was by far the single largest Liaison Delegate meeting so far, with more than 500 people in attendance and an absolutely action-packed 3-day agenda. And I know you're brimming with insights as a result, so we thought we would take the opportunity to share some of those that are front of mind with our members. So perhaps to kick us off, let's start with an area where we as SBC have recently enhanced our focus, and that is in the nature space. Off the back of this conference, what are some of your key reflections on what's happening globally in the nature space?
Well, kia ora, Nicole, and thanks for the opportunity to reflect on that experience. Yeah, well, I suppose the thing that surprised me this time is just how fast things have moved in the nature space from a corporate perspective. So it was only really 2 years ago that people started introducing the term the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, which is the cousin to TCFD. And yet here we are in 2023, and in September of this year, it will launch. And that's, for anyone who's been involved in the TCFD process, that's twice the speed of that process. I was impressed with how quickly it's progressed. We're now down to talking about metrics. The framework is largely in place. And I think what came from the conversations for me were that companies, certainly the companies that were at the conference, are leaning into it and ready for taking action. They are concerned that they don't really understand what it will mean in practice yet. You know, what sort of data will they have to collect? How will it work with TCFD? All of those sorts of things. But the fact that we're getting down into that kind of operational element says that we've moved well beyond the concept of nature being an important part of reporting. So I think that was one of my big takeaways in the nature space. This is happening. It's happening at pace. The corporate sector is largely on board with it. And it looks like it's implementable from the exposure draft that we saw a month ago. It really comes down now to, how will companies actually execute this and implement it. The second piece for me was that the CEO of WBCSD, Peter Backer, gave a very impassioned speech at the beginning. It was the most, I suppose, emotional speech I've ever seen him give, which essentially was, we are not hitting our targets. And not only are we not hitting our targets for climate, we're not hitting our targets for biodiversity and nature. And he put up some statistics which were truly frightening of just the rate of degradation of the natural system. Now, to any of those of us who've been involved in this area for a while, none of this is a surprise. I suppose what is a surprise is how, blunt his message was to the corporate sector, which is that you have a responsibility to lean into nature, and thinking that it can be solved by government is no longer an option. There is a role here for business in nature. So I took away from that I'm really pleased that we introduced nature into our strategy, and that there's a lot for us to do, but that we will need to partner up on this because it is a relatively new area for SBC. Certainly over the last few years, we've focused almost exclusively on climate. So it is new. So we're looking for partners, and there'll be more on that in the next few months as we start pivoting towards adding nature into our portfolio.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Mike. That's hugely, hugely insightful. One of the other key items on the agenda was COP28 coming up later this year. And given its business focus, we've been talking a lot recently about what that's going to mean for SBC and our members. Where would you say WBCSD is at with their planning and their intentions for this year's COP conference?
Well, the good news is we had a couple of sessions on COP28, and WBCSD is much larger than it used to be. For those who've been following WBCSD, it used to be, sort of 30, 40 people. Even as late as 2019, it was only a little over 100. It's over 200 people now. Now, the upside of that is that it means that they can really lean into international conferences like COP28, and you can see that in the preparation. And so we had a roundtable session, series of roundtables. Actually, there were 10 different sessions running simultaneously on COP28, the preparation for it. My takeaway from that is, on the technical side and down at the, sector level, I think that WBCSD is incredibly well prepared. And if we want to lean into that as an affiliate of WBCSD, we're very welcome to. So I think there's some opportunities there for us to tap into the reporting side of things, They're doing some really interesting things around transport, the energy piece. There's a whole lot of stuff there. And if people are interested in that, really keen to dialogue with companies on where they might want to join in with the WBCSD effort. What I did think was absent from it, and I challenged WBCSD on this, was the big ticket item, which is what are we taking as the principal announceable to COP28? And in fact, I called for that in my closing on day 2. And that's been well received, although they put it back on us to say, well, what would you want there to be? And I think, our answer to that would be the equivalent of a CLC, but global. Our view would be, now that will have to be built up from the ground, of course, so it will be country by country. But what I think that means for us is showcasing CLC, warts and all, recognizing that, there are challenges within reaching our targets, just as there are anywhere else in the world. But what I realized was that there really isn't another version of the Climate Leaders Coalition out there. And there are sort of partial versions, but nothing like the scale of what we've got there. People are very inspired by CLC, and I think we sometimes forget that back here in New Zealand. So bringing that to COP28, I think, is really important, showcasing that and laying down the gauntlet, challenging other countries to say, well, if little old New Zealand at the bottom of the world can do this, surely some of you larger countries can do a similar thing. And by setting those targets, and by publishing them annually, and by holding each other to account, and by supporting each other, you can really build momentum. And that's what we're trying to do with CLC, and we're succeeding. So I think that was the big takeaway for me around COP28.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. These WBCSD meetings offer great insights into how international companies are accelerating their sustainability action. What would you say are some of your reflections in how companies are embedding ESG into their strategies and using that to drive change?
That's a really interesting question. We actually had a specific session on embedding ESG in strategy. And what I thought was really interesting listening to the corporate sector on that was a change. So it had been before that they were sort of injecting ESG into the strategy. So yes, it was becoming mainstream and they were sort of bringing it in, but it was still apart from it was in the strategy, but it was its own section, as it were. What we're seeing now is people using ESG as a change tool, a way of saying, actually, we need to be rethinking what our business is doing. We need to be rethinking that at quite a fundamental level. ESG and sustainability more generally provides a really useful framework for doing that. Why? Because, as I've said many times, it's all about timeframes. With sustainability, you're looking out over decades as opposed to a financial year. And that makes you think about, well, what's coming down the track? What are the opportunities, but also the risks? But more importantly, it's a change of mindset. We often talk about system change, and we often talk about thinking about things systemically. Well, these are the sort of skills that you need when you're operating in an uncertain world, like the world we're operating at the moment. So I think what people have come to realize is that if they're looking for a toolbox that helps them for strategizing in an uncertain world, the ESG toolbox is not a bad place to start, because it allows you to look at these problems from a range of different dimensions and then work out what are the priority areas for you and implement them. So I thought that was one thing that was quite interesting. There still is a question mark over whether ESG itself as a tool, as a framework, is the right framework, and there's quite a lot of debate about whether or not that's yesterday's toolbox and we need a modern one. I think the general feeling was it'll do for now. It'll do for now. Maybe there's a better way of doing things, and you're seeing the emergence of other tools and other frameworks. But for the moment, it's not a bad one. It's quite pragmatic. People understand it. There's the language is a common language, so there's a way of communicating within companies and between companies. So I think for the moment, it's seen as a useful toolbox. I think the final thing that I thought was quite interesting was that just as people are getting their head around nature, so now social sustainability, the S, is becoming really, really big. And of course, they launched. There was a launch of the strategy around inequality at this event, and it was really interesting. It was a packed event, a lot of interest, and companies are recognizing that again, they can't stand back from this. Rising inequality in Europe and around the world, partly as a result of the global pandemic, but other reasons as well, means that this is having an actual effect on companies. It's having an effect on how they run and their bottom line, and also on the well-being of their people as they operate within these very challenging societies where inequality is becoming obviously much greater. And so I think that the work that we're currently doing on strengthening the S in ESG is very timely, because many others are thinking that same way. There's some stuff that we can learn from companies internationally, I think. But my takeaway was most people are quite early in this journey, nowhere near as advanced as they are in nature and climate. So that was quite reassuring to me, because our first look at this was that it was going to be quite a complex area. But yeah, it was my takeaway on ESG.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like definitely a timely thing to be to be looking at, particularly the social piece. Cool. So the final day of the conference focused on the WBCSD Global Network, and we as SBC are New Zealand's only global network partner. What exactly does this mean for SBC, and how do we kind of plug into that global conversation as a result?
Yeah, really good question. Look, I think the first thing to understand is that, and I've said this before, but WBCSD is like a very big SBC in the sense that it has a membership. It has around I think it's around about 180 companies now, paying big fees. They pay in excess of $100,000 US dollars to become members, and that is what WBCSD is. But of course, it has a set of satellites around it, which are the global network partners, of which we are one. Now, there are nearly 60 of these satellites. About 40 of them, I would say, are quite proactive. The other 20 a little quieter. And they range in scale from organizations that are just 2 or 3 people all the way through to some that are several hundred. And so we're sort of at the smaller end of the scale, but I would say we're small but perfectly formed. We do many of the things that these other organizations do. I suppose I have 3 big takeaways. One is that I think that our strategy is looked upon by others as being best in class. They're saying what we like about your strategy is it's very focused, it's very outcome focused, and it has a combination of B2B work, where we work collaboratively to support one another through our sustainability journeys, but it also has this outward influencing piece through advocacy. It's a really mixed bag as to whether or not other organizations do that. Some do, some don't. But they sort of look at us and they say, well, for a little organization, you guys seem to punch above your weight. So that's nice, positive reinforcement back to us. What I am aware of, though, is that there is an enormous amount of information, both within WBCSD as an organization and as a sort of a repository of knowledge, but also within that network. And so one of the things that I'm really keen to do this year is not just to tap into what WBCSD, the organization, is doing, but what the network is doing. And I was quite inspired by 2 particular things. One was I thought that the leading work that France and a couple of other European countries are doing in the nature space would be directly applicable to us. And so I thought there were some areas where we could learn from that and apply that knowledge back into New Zealand. So I thought that was really useful, particularly relating to TNFD. So for me, that was something nice and tangible that we could do. Yeah. The other was I looked at the way in which some of the regional groupings work and how influential they are, particularly the Latin American group, I think are incredibly well organized. And what they've done more recently is they've looked at the WBCSD strategy and then said, well, how do we then apply that in our regional level? And I think there's something in that for what we could do as part of the Asia Pacific group to say, well, how do we apply that strategy better within our country? So I think those are a couple of things. The final thing would just be that the resourcing that WBCSD has is quite substantial. And so being able to leverage that network to affect global change, I think, is a really important part of being part of that network. We're really privileged, and I'm very aware of that when I go to these meetings. We don't pay a fee. We're not a member. We're just invited to come along as a partner, and yet we get, we get a voice. We get listened to, and the opportunities for networking and collaboration are there. I think that's a fantastic opportunity. If you think about it, that's what differentiates us from other sustainability organizations in New Zealand. We have that connection to this international network. So I've come back with some ideas around that. The team is going to be looking at how we do more collaborations globally so that we can amplify the work that we do here in New Zealand, but also so we can bring lessons back here as well. So I came away pretty energized by the whole thing, and that network is pretty inspiring, actually.
Yeah, I can imagine. On that note, looking out ahead, when would you say is the next key opportunity for SBC to actually engage on the WBCSD front?
Yeah, really good question. So we have a quarterly meeting with our colleagues in the Asia Pacific, and the next one of those is about 6 weeks from now. So we'll be doing that obviously online. They're actually having an in-person event in Singapore in June. Sadly, I'll be unable to attend that, but it is something that we'll be letting our members know about, particularly if they have representatives in or around Singapore, because again, an opportunity to plug in with like-minded companies and look for collaborations, look for ideas to share, etc. The next big one will be just ahead of COP28. So that is the WBCSD Council meeting. That's towards the end of November. I think it's 28th and 29th of November. And then 30th, bang, we're straight away into COP28. That's intentional. The idea with that is it's very COP-centric. So it's very much about preparing for the things that WBCSD and its companies will be saying at COP28. So that'll be the next big one.
Awesome. We'll look forward to following how that planning develops, and we'll also be sure to keep our members across any updates. Thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time to share your valuable insights with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great pleasure, and looking forward to the next one.